We continue to read the book by Antonio Damasio, Self Comes to Mind. And this is the second part, at least for my reading, Goals and the Reasons. This book is dedicated to addressing two questions. First, how does the brain construct a mind? Second, how does the brain make that mind conscious? I am aware of that addressing questions like this is not the same as answering them, and that on the matter of the conscious mind, it would be foolish to presume definitive answers. Moreover, I realize that the study of a consciousness has expanded so much that it is no longer possible to do justice to all contributions being made to it. That, along with issues of terminology and perspective, make current work on consciousness resemble a walk through a minefield. Nevertheless, at one's own peril, it is reasonable to think through the questions and use the current evidence, incomplete and provisional as it is, to build testable conjectures and dream about the future. The goal of this book is to reflect on the conjectures and discuss a framework of a hypothesis. The focus is on how the human brain needs to be structured and how it needs to operate in order for conscious minds to emerge. Books should be written for a reason, and this one was written to start over. I have been studying the human mind and brain for more than 30 years, and I have previously written about consciousness in scientific articles and books. But I have grown dissatisfied with my account of the problem, and the reflection on relevant research findings, new and old, has changed my views on two issues in particular: the origin and the nature of feelings and the mechanisms behind the construction of the self. This book is an attempt to discuss the current views. In no small measure, the book is also about what we still do not know, but wish we did. The remainder of chapter 1 situates the problem, explains the framework chosen to address it, and previews the main ideas that will emerge in the chapters ahead. Some readers may find that the long presentation in chapter 1 slows down the reading, but I promise it will also make the rest of the book all the more accessible. Approaching the problem. Before we attempt to make some headway on the matter of how the human brain constructs a conscious mind, we need to acknowledge two important legacies. One of them consists of prior attempts to discover the neural basis of consciousness in efforts that date back to the middle of the 20th century. In a series of pioneering studies conducted in North America and Italy, a small band of investigators pointed with astonishing certainty to a brain sector that is now unequivocally related to the making of a consciousness. The brain stem related to the making of consciousness, the brain stem, and identified it as a critical contributor to consciousness. Not surprisingly, in light of what we know today, the account provided by these pioneers, Wilder Penfield, Herbert Jasper, Gisby Moruzzi, and Horace Morgan, was incomplete, and parts of it were less than correct. but one should have nothing but praise and admiration for the scientists who intuited the right target and aimed at it with such precision. This was the brave beginning of the enterprise to which several of us wish to contribute today. Also part of this legacy are studies performed more recently in neurological patients whose consciousness was compromised by focal brain damage. The work of Fred Bloom and Jerome Posner launched the effort. Over the years, these studies, complementing those of the consciousness research pioneers, have yielded a powerful collection of facts regarding the brain structures that are or are not involved in making human minds conscious. We can build on that foundation. The other legacy to be acknowledged consists of a long tradition of formulating conceptions of a mind and consciousness. It has a rich history, as long and varied as the history of philosophy. From the wealth of its offerings, I have come to favor the writings of William James as an anchor for my own thinking, although this does not imply a full endorsement of his positions on consciousness and especially on feeling. The title of this book, as well as its first pages, leave no doubt that in approaching the conscious mind, I privilege the self. I believe a conscious mind reads when a self process is added onto a basic mind process. When selves do not occur within minds, those minds are not conscious in the proper sense. This is a predicament faced by humans whose self-process is suspended by dreamless asleep, anesthesia, or brain disease. Defending the self-process that I regard as so indispensable for consciousness, however, is easier said than done. That is why William James is so helpful to this preamble. James wrote eloquently about the importance of the self, and yet he also noted that on many occasions, the presence of the self is so subtle that the contents of the mind dominate the consciousness as they stream along. We need to confront this elusiveness and decide on its consequences before we go any further. Is there a self or is there not? If there is a self, is it present whenever we are conscious or is it not? The answers are unequivocal. There is indeed a self, but it is a process, not a thing. And the process is present at all times when we are presumed to be conscious. We can consider the self process from two vantage points. One is the vantage point of an observer appreciating a dynamic object. The dynamic object constituted by certain workings of our minds, certain traits of behavior, and a certain history of life. The other vantage point is that of the self as a knower, the process that gives a focus to our experiences and eventually lets us reflect on those experiences. Combining the two vantage points produces the do notion of self used throughout the book. As we shall see, the two notions correspond to two stages of evolutionary development of the self. The self as a knower, having had its origin in the self as object. In everyday life, each notion corresponds to a level of operation of the conscious mind. The self as object being similar in scope than the self as a knower. From either vantage point, the process has a varied scopes and intensities, and its manifestations vary with the occasions. The self can operate on a subtle register as a hint, half hinted, of the presence of a living organism, or on a salient register that includes personhood and identity for the owner of the mind. Now you sense it, now you don't, but you always feel it, is my way of summing up the situation. James thought that the self as object, the material me, was the sum total of all that a man could call his, not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his wife and children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank account. Leaving aside the political incorrectness, I agree. But James also thought something else with which I'm in even greater agreement. What allows the mind to know that such dominations, such domains, such dominations exist and belong to their mental owners, body, mind, past and present, and all the rest is that the perception of any of these items generates emotions and feelings, and in turn, the feelings accomplish the separation between the contents that belong to the self and those that do not. From my perspective, such a feeling operates as markers. They are the emotion-based signals I designated as somatic markers. When contents that pertain to the self occur in the mind stream, they provoke the appearance of a marker, which joins the mind stream as an image, juxtaposed to the image that prompted it. These feelings accomplish a distinction between self and non-self. They are, in a nutshell, feelings of a knowing. We shall see that the construction of a conscious mind depends at several stages on the generation of such feelings. As for my working definition of the material me, the self as object, it is as follows. A dynamic collection of integrated neural processes centered on the representation of the living body that finds expression in a dynamic collection of integrated mental processes. Let me repeat. A dynamic collection of integrated neural processes centered on the representation of the living body that finds expression in a dynamic collection of integrated mental processes. Well, I still can't understand it very well. The self as a subject, as knower, as the I, is a more elusive presence, far less collected in mental or biological terms than the me, more dispersed, often dissolved in the stream of consciousness, at times so annoyingly subtle that it is there but almost not there. The self as knower is more difficult to capture them plainly, unquestionably. But that does not diminish its significance for consciousness. The self as a subject and a knower is not only a very real presence, but a turning point in biological evolution. We can imagine that the self as a subject and the knower is stacked, so to speak, on top of the self as object, as a new layer of neural processes, giving rise to yet another layer of mental processing. There's no dichotomy between self as object and self as a knower. There is rather a continuity and progression. The self as knower is grounded as the self as object. Consciousness is not merely about images in the mind. It is, in the very least, about the organization of a mind contents centered on the organism that produces and motivates those contents. But the consciousness, in the sense that the reader and the author can experience anytime they wish, is more than a mind organized under the influence of a living, acting organism. It is also a mind capable of knowing that such a living, acting organism exists. To be sure, the fact that the brain succeeds in creating neural patterns that map things experienced as images is an important part of the process of being conscious. Orienting the images in the perspective of the organism is also a part of the process. But that is not the same as automatically and explicitly knowing that images exist within me and are mine and in current lingo, actionable. The mere presence of organized images flowing in a mental stream produces a mind. But unless some supplementary process is added on, the mind remains unconscious. What is missing from that consciousness mind is a self. What the brain needs in order to become conscious is to acquire a new property, subjectivity, and a defining trait of subjectivity is the feeling that pervades the images we experience subjectively. For contemporary treatment of the importance of subjectivity from the perspective of philosophy, read John Searle's The Mystery of Consciousness. In keeping with this idea, the decisive step in the making of a consciousness is not the making of images and creating the basics of a mind. The decisive step is making the images ours, making them belong to their rightful owners, the singular, perfectly bounded organisms in which they emerge, in the perspective of evolution and in the perspective of one's life history. The knower came in steps, the proto-self and its primordial feelings, the action-driven core self, and finally the autobiographical self, which incorporates social and spiritual dimensions. But these are dynamic processes, not rigid things, and on any day, their level fluctuates. Simple, complex, somewhere in between, and can be readily adjusted as the circumstances dictate. A knower, by whatever name one may want to call it, self, experiencer, or protagonist, needs to be generated in the brain if the mind is to become conscious. When the brain manages to introduce a knower in the mind the subjectivity follows. Should the reader wonder if this defense of the self is necessary, let me say that it is quite justified. At this very moment, those of us in neuroscience whose work aims at elucidating consciousness subscribe to very different attitudes toward the self. The attitudes range from considering the self as an indispensable topic of the research agenda to thinking that the time has not come to deal with the subject literally. Given that the work associated with either attitude continues to produce useful ideas, there's no need as yet to decide which approach will turn out to be more satisfactory. But we need to understand, we need to acknowledge that the resulting accounts are different. In the meantime, it is noteworthy that these two attitudes perpetuate a difference of interpretation that separated William James from David Hume, one that is generally overlooked in such discussions. James wanted to make certain that his conceptions of self had a firm biological grounding. His self would not be mistaken for a metaphysical knowing agency. But that did not prevent him from recognizing a knowing function for the self, even when the function was subtle rather than exuberant. David Hume, on the other hand, polarized the self to the point of doing away with it. The following passages illustrate Hume's views. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and can never observe anything but the perception. And further on, I may venture to affirm the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with inconceivable rapidity and are in a perceptual flux at the moment. Commenting on Hume's dismissal of the self, James was moved to issue a memorable rebuke and affirm the existence of the self, emphasizing the odd mixture of unity and diversity within it, and calling attention to the core of a sameness running through the ingredients of the self. The foundation discussed here has been modified and expanded upon by philosophers and neuroscientists to include different aspects of a self. But the significance of the self for the construction of the conscious mind has not been diminished. I doubt that the neural basis for the conscious mind can be comprehensively elucidated without first accounting for the self as object, the material me, and for the self as knower. Contemporary work on philosophy of mind and psychology has extended the conceptual legacy, while the extraordinary development of general biology, evolutionary biology, and neuroscience has capitalized on the neural legacy, produced a wide array of techniques to investigate the brain, and amassed a colossal amount of facts. The evidence, conjectures, and hypotheses presented in this book are grounded on all these developments. Okay, that's the end of this section. I think we should stop. I read it. It's very hard to understand, so I need to continue to read it. If you like it, please forward and let me know if you have any questions. Bye-bye.